The Zeigarnik effect is often described in a simple way. Unfinished tasks stay active in the mind. That basic idea is still useful, but it needs a more careful explanation. The original phenomenon was named after Bluma Zeigarnik, a Soviet psychologist trained in the Gestalt tradition, who reported in 1927 that interrupted tasks were remembered better than completed ones. Later reviews have kept her finding historically important, but more recent evidence suggests the effect is not a universal law of memory in the strong form people often repeat online. More recent research suggests that what is often more reliable is not necessarily better memory for every unfinished task, but a persistent tendency to return to interrupted activity. That distinction matters. If we understand the Zeigarnik effect too crudely, we end up with a slogan rather than a tool. The more accurate psychological insight is this: incomplete goals often remain cognitively active because the mind treats them as unresolved. The old Gestalt explanation, shaped by Kurt Lewin, the German psychologist whose research focused on motivation, tension systems, and goal-directed behavior, was that beginning an intention creates a kind of psychological tension that is discharged only when the task is brought to completion. That older logic still helps explain why interrupted tasks may continue to pull on attention even if they are not always remembered better in a laboratory recall test. This is where the Zeigarnik effect becomes useful for everyday intellectual work. Much of knowledge work depends on returning to difficult tasks after interruptions. Writing, coding, reading theory, designing lessons, analyzing data, and solving conceptual problems all require sustained re-entry. An incomplete task can act like a cognitive hook. Because the mind has not mentally closed the loop, it is easier to re-engage. That is why many people find it easier to resume a paragraph they stopped midway through than to start a blank page from nothing. The unfinished state preserves momentum, not necessarily by magic, but by keeping the goal psychologically alive. What seems especially dependable is the tendency to resume interrupted activity. Modern motivation research sharpens this picture. E.J. Masicampo, a social psychologist whose research examines how goals shape thought and attention, and Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist known for his work on self-regulation, motivation, and the self, showed that unfinished goals can produce intrusive thoughts and interfere with tasks that require executive control. In one line of work, they found that unfulfilled goals remained mentally accessible and disrupted performance on unrelated activities. That means incompletion has a double edge. It can preserve engagement, but it can also consume mental bandwidth. An open loop can help you come back, or it can keep pulling at your mind while you are trying to do something else. This is why incomplete tasks do not automatically improve productivity. They improve productivity only when the incompletion is structured rather than chaotic. An unfinished chapter can help a writer return the next morning with continuity. But 10 unfinished chapters, 3 half-answered emails, a browser full of tabs, and 6 vague obligations do not create intelligent tension. They create fragmentation. The real productivity lesson is not leave everything unfinished. It is leave the right thing unfinished in the right way. Intellectual productivity grows when incompletion preserves direction without multiplying noise. The most useful nuance from Masicampo and Baumeister's research is that the mind does not always need full completion to quiet down. Often, it needs a plan. Their work found that making a specific plan for an unfinished goal could eliminate much of the cognitive disruption usually caused by the open loop. This is a powerful correction to the usual popular version of the Zeigarnik effect. The mind is not merely asking, "Is this done?" It is often asking, "Do I know what happens next?" Once the next step is clear, the task no longer has to keep shouting for attention. In practical terms, a precise note such as revise paragraph 3 and add the citation from the 2015 review is psychologically far more calming than a vague reminder such as finish article. That insight helps explain a surprising sleep study too. Michael Scullin, a professor of psychology and neuroscience whose research focuses on sleep, cognition, and prospective memory, found that participants who wrote a to-do list before bed fell asleep faster than those who wrote about completed activities. At first glance, this seems to contradict the Zeigarnik effect, because writing down unfinished tasks sounds as though it should activate them more strongly. But the likely explanation is that writing functions as cognitive offloading. The task is still incomplete, yet the brain no longer has to keep rehearsing it internally because it has been captured externally in an organized form. In other words, the unfinished task becomes less mentally noisy when it is turned into a concrete representation. So, how can incomplete tasks be used deliberately to reclaim focus rather than sabotage it? One method is to stop work at a meaningful midpoint rather than at a dead end. A researcher might stop after outlining the next argument, not after closing the file in confusion. A student might stop after solving the first half of a problem set, not after vaguely deciding to study later. A teacher designing material might stop after drafting the opening section and listing the next 2 examples to write. This leaves behind a living thread. The task is unfinished, but it is psychologically warm. It has shape, direction, and an obvious re-entry point. That kind of incompletion is often productive because it preserves continuity. A second method is to pair every incomplete task with an explicit next action. This is where the Zeigarnik effect becomes a discipline rather than an accident. Instead of trusting the mind to keep the task alive through tension alone, you give it a small bridge back into action. The bridge can be a sentence, a sticky note, or a line at the top of the draft. The point is to convert a vague cognitive burden into a defined future move. Once that happens, you keep the benefit of incompletion while reducing the cost of rumination. A third method is to use incomplete tasks selectively. The effect is most helpful for deep work, where continuity matters. It is less helpful when many low-value obligations are left hanging at once. Not all open loops are equal. A strategically paused essay draft may enhance tomorrow's concentration. 20 unresolved micro-obligations may erode it. The mind does not distinguish only by number, but also by significance, ambiguity, and emotional charge. That is why some unfinished tasks sit quietly in the background while others keep intruding. A cognitively demanding open loop with no next step is much more likely to drain attention. There is also a deeper philosophical lesson here. The mind is not merely a storage device, it is an orientation system. It keeps leaning toward what feels unfinished, unresolved, or still demanded by the future. In that sense, the Zeigarnik effect is not just about memory, it is about unfinished intention. Our thought life is shaped not only by what has happened, but by what remains open. Intellectual productivity, therefore, depends partly on how skillfully we manage these openings. We do not need to finish everything in order to think clearly, but we do need to know which tasks deserve continued tension, which ones need a next step, and which ones need to be consciously released. The real promise of the Zeigarnik effect is not that unfinished tasks are magically good for us. It is that incompletion, when used wisely, can become a tool of continuity. Leave one important task alive. Pause at a fertile point. Mark the next move. Let the mind keep the thread, but do not force it to carry the whole burden in silence. That is how an incomplete task stops being a leak in attention and becomes a lever for for focus.